Hiya, welcome back to Never Judge a Book by its cover. This is chapter 2. Home sweet home, thought Steve as he arrived at the gate of a 3-bedroom semi-detached, which for the Midlands was a typical post-war house, built in red brick, an average-sized garden surrounded by a wooden panel fence. It was no spectacular sight. In fact, it was almost identical to the other houses in the street, which was mirrored by the rest of the streets on the estate. This was usual for the council housing schemes of its time in that area, but to Steve, it was home. He and an old-time pal, Eddie Lewis, had bought the house some 6 years previous as a bachelor pad, which it remained as for a while until Eddie became attached to a young lady while Steve was on a 6-month tour of Northern Ireland with his regiment. One thing led to another, and before long she'd set up home with them. That was the end of the bachelor pad and the all-night boozy parties, but Steve managed to live with it, as he was very rarely at home anyway, due to his military commitments. Besides, Eddie's girlfriend, Abigail, kept the place clean and tidy. She made sure the lads were well fed and watered, and an added bonus was the rent money that she contributed towards the mortgage repayments. So on the whole, they were all financially better off, and all parties concerned were fairly content with the arrangement. The dark green door opened before Steve was halfway up the garden path. He was greeted by Eddie, standing in the doorway, wearing moccasin-style slippers and grey jogging bottoms, seated low, with a tight white t-shirt rising up that exposed his lower gut. "So what's it like to be a civvy then, Mr. Campbell?" "I don't know yet. Give us a chance and I'll find out. Is the kettle on?" "Of course. Let me take your bag, mate. You look knackered." "Oh, cheers, mate. You look like you lost a bit of weight." "Not," mocked Steve, then handed over his bag, and he removed his damp jacket. He hung it on a peg in the porchway before taking off his boots and placing them neatly on a mat. Abigail was stood at the kitchen sink peeling potatoes in preparation for dinner, whilst Eddie was brewing up a pot of tea. Steve could hear whispering suppressed by the sound of running tap water as he warmed himself in front of the radiant gas fire. He couldn't quite catch what was being said, yet by the tone of their voices he could tell that the two were bickering for some reason or another. It was obvious that Eddie was pleased to see his oldest friend return home. However, things were different now, and it was clear that neither he nor his beloved Abigail were keen to share the house again on a permanent basis, as an alternative to occasionally when Steve was at home on leave. After all, it had been more than several months since he was home last, and the couple had become accustomed to having the place to themselves. Eddie raised his voice. "Shut up, woman, he'll hear us." "Well, say something then, you wuss," barked Abigail sharply. I will, when the time's right." "And when will that be?" "Gives a chance, Ab, he's only just through the bloody door," reasoned Eddie. "Well, if you don't bring it up soon, I will." Yeah, whatever." Steam was rising from the black denim of Steve's jeans. He was crouched, eating his hands when Eddie came back into the room. He was carrying 2 mugs of piping hot tea. "There you go," he said, handing one to Steve. "Milky with 2 sugars. Just how you like it." Steve took a sip and sat back into a comfortable armchair. The tea was exactly how he liked it. He had never had sugar in his tea or coffee when he was younger. It was a taste he'd acquired whilst out on rifle ranges or during other excursions with the army when tea was provided. The thermal Norwegian tea urns they used would always be dosed up to a minimum equivalent of 2 heap spoons per mug. So those who didn't start out with a sweet tooth soon developed one. That's a nice of tea, that, Ed." Eddie just smiled. "Ed, if something was wrong, mate, you'd tell me, wouldn't you?" Eddie paused for a second. "Yeah, of course I would, Steve." Steve stared sternly at Eddie. "Good. We go back a long way, Lou. You know, if something's up, you can be straight with me." Eddie's eyes flitted nervously around the room, then back to Steve. "Sure, mate, but now it's up, honest. Now get your brew down you before it's cold." He checked his wristwatch. Dinner won't be long. He changed the subject. For the next 20 minutes or so, they caught up on each other's gossip, making up for lost time. They chatted away like a couple of old women queuing for the pensions. During the conversation, Steve wondered what it was that Eddie couldn't bring himself to tell him. He knew that Abigail was busy cooking dinner, but he was sure that she could have dragged herself away from the hob for at least long enough to say hello, welcome home. Oh well, he thought, whatever the problem was, he felt it couldn't be serious, and it would emerge sooner or later. The atmosphere was tense throughout dinner. Barely a few words were uttered. After they'd eaten, Steve showered, shaved, pressed his clothes, and dressed for the night ahead. By the time he was ready, it was approaching 8 o'clock. As he walked into the living room, Eddie Wolf whistled. Very smart. Going somewhere nice? Eddie and Abigail were sat apart, which Steve thought was odd. Well, actually, I've got an interview. I was wondering if there's any chance of a lift downtown, Ed. Phew, don't waste any time. Where's it at? Eddie asked, glancing at the wall clock. Tamler's, with Bob on the door. Eddie removed his rounded spectacles, rubbed his eyes, and exhaled out loud. Rather you than me, mate. I wouldn't work there if you paid me. Steve tittered. That's the general idea, Ed. People do get paid to work there, you clown. Eddie wasn't laughing. I'm serious, Steve. I wouldn't bother if I were you. Have a couple of weeks to find your feet. Use the time to acclimatise to Civvy Street a bit. Steve was slightly concerned to hear Loopy gain for anything Lou's negative response. Perhaps he was going soft in his old age, he thought. Are you pulling my pisser? What's up with Tamler's? They've been getting loads of aggro just lately, Eddie replied. What sort of aggro? The Grangers want to buy the place. They're up there most weekends with their cronies, running riot and harassing the staff. A couple of bouncers and a barman have been done over on the way home recently. And rumour has it, which you don't have to be Magnum PR to work it out, that Gazzy's behind it. You really have got to be pulling me pisser. You are joking, are you? No, I ain't, mate. They reckon if they cause enough grief, the value will go down and the bloke who owns it will chuck the for sale signs up. I've already told Bob to watch his back. Well, he won't have to now. I'll watch it for him, remarked Steve. Yeah, and I hope he watches yours. The Grangers were a big family of hardheads, bullies and rogues. It was rumoured that they descended from Irish gypsies, which they denied passionately. Although well known, they weren't generally liked, and were usually avoided by most decent people. However, they had gained a cult following, constituting of petty criminals, teenage wannabe gangsters, and a few small-time drug dealers, who were mostly users themselves. They owned a third-rate, dingy yet busy little club in Bransfield town, which was mysteriously became subject to an arson attack prior to the previous proprietor's early retirement. It wasn't much of a nightclub really, more of a tackly jazzed up working man's club, where you could get a game of cards at 4 in the morning. I thought the Grangers had gaties, asked Steve. They do, that's the trouble. They've got their fingers in a lot of pies. Between them, they've got businesses all over town, not all above board neither, and they're always keen to expand. The money-grabbing bastards. You're not wrong. Things round here have changed a bit, kid. These fuckers think they're the mafia in the swinging 60s or something. Half the time they're off their faces on crack